Montana Territory. Spring of 1879, the wind howled low across the high plains as Naomi Dearing stuffed the last of her belongings into the saddlebag, her fingers shaking with cold and something worse. She had planned to be gone before sunrise. She stood inside the barn of the Broken Cedar Ranch, boots in the straw, eyes wet, heart hammering like a freight train on a downhill track. Outside, the sky was just beginning to fade from black to blue. In another half hour, dawn would crack over the ridgeline. She had to be gone by then, disappear before anyone noticed, before he noticed. Naomi had come here nearly a year ago, a widow with nowhere else to go and a 6-year-old son, Jacob, clinging to her skirts. The ranch owner's wife, a distant cousin, had taken them in for a time, but after her cousin passed from a fever last fall, the place slowly emptied out. The ranch was now barely kept alive by a handful of hired hands and one man who never seemed to stop working, the cowboy, who had found her son near frozen behind the barn last November and carried him straight into the warmth of the house without saying a word. Zeke Callahan. Zeke was the kind of man who looked like he belonged to the land. Tall, sun-browned, broad across the shoulders, and quiet in a way that made people lean in to listen. He had been kind but distant, steady but unreadable. Naomi hadn't known what to make of him. Then slowly, too slowly, she'd started to understand. He watched over Jacob like he was his own, fixed things before she could ask, left firewood stacked by the door. He never knocked, just dropped things off like it was nothing. But it was not nothing, and that was the problem, because Naomi had been here too long. She had started to hope again, and hope, she had learned, was dangerous. She tightened the saddle strap on her old mare and stepped back, heart clenching. Jacob was asleep inside, curled up beneath a quilt stitched from scraps of his father's shirts. Naomi had folded a note to leave on the table, explaining everything. Just enough to make sure Zeke would take care of Jacob. That was all she could allow herself to ask. She turned to lead her horse out and stopped cold. Zeke stood in the barn doorway. He did not speak right away. Just stood there, arms crossed, hat low over his brows, watching her like he had known she would try this. "You were really going to leave without saying a word?" His voice was quiet, but it filled the barn like thunder. Naomi swallowed and looked away. "It is better this way." "For who?" "For Jacob." Her voice cracked. "For me." Zeke stepped closer, boots slow and deliberate on the dirt. "You think I would let you ride out alone into the mountains with nothing but that tired horse and a boy who would wake up crying for his mother?" Naomi gripped the reins tighter. "I am not asking your permission. No, you are just running." She looked up, eyes blazing. "You do not understand." "Then explain it. You do not know what it is like to lose everything, to have no one left and still try to survive every day for a child who asks questions you cannot answer." Zeke's jaw clenched. He crossed the last few steps between them and took the reins gently from her hands. "You think I do not know loss? You think I have not buried people I loved? You think I do not see the way you hold that boy like the world is trying to steal him from you?" Her lips parted, but she could not speak. "I see you, Naomi." His voice dropped low. "And I have spent the last year waiting for you to stop running. But I will not let you run from me now." Tears blurred her eyes. "You are just a cowboy." Zeke smiled, tired and tender. "Maybe, but I am a man who loves you." Naomi's breath caught. "I do not want your help," she whispered. "That is a lie." He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. She flinched, then leaned into it without meaning to. "You were planning to leave before sunrise," he said, voice soft now. Until the cowboy said, "Stay and love me instead." She stared at him, stunned. The barn felt suddenly too quiet, the world outside frozen in that breath between night and day. "I have nothing left to give," she said. "You have everything," he answered. You just do not know it yet. Her chest ached. Her hands trembled. Zeke stepped closer, cupped her face in his calloused hands. Let me take care of you. Let me be the one who stays. For you. For Jacob. Naomi closed her eyes. A tear slid down her cheek. Inside the house, Jacob stirred. The sound of his small feet padding across the floor reached her ears. She opened her eyes, looked at Zeke. You really mean it? She asked. I have never meant anything more. Something inside her cracked open, slow and deep. She nodded once, then again. Zeke pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her like he was anchoring her to something real. She let herself sink into him, her face against his chest, his warmth chasing away the cold that had lived in her for too long. Behind them, the first rays of sun spilled over the ridge. The day had begun and she was still here, with him, with hope. The coffee boiled over just as Naomi folded the last of Jacob's shirts into the pine chest at the foot of the bed. She left the lid open and hurried to the stove, lifting the pot off with a hiss of steam and setting it aside. The morning had moved slow and strange, like the world had shifted a degree sideways, and she was waiting to see where it would settle. Zeke hadn't stayed long after she'd agreed to stay. He'd only pressed his lips to her temple and whispered he'd come back later, then walked out into the early light with the same sure-footedness he carried through everything. That had been hours ago. Now the sun sat higher, touching the rafters of the kitchen, sealing through the window pane, and Jacob was outside with the ranch dogs, following them like a shadow. His laughter rose now and then, light and unburdened, and Naomi listened with a hollow sort of ache. She was used to making choices in silence. Now she'd made one that echoed. When the knock came, it was soft. She dried her hands on her apron and opened the door to find Mrs. Adeline Morrow standing on the stoop, cheeks pink from the wind, a basket looped over her arm. I saw Zeke riding toward the southern pasture, she said, stepping inside without waiting. Figured I'd find you here, not gone like folks were whispering yesterday. Naomi shut the door and turned to face the older woman. I changed my mind. Adeline's sharp eyes swept the room. Good. That child of yours would have howled the whole way down the mountain if you'd taken him out in this weather. Naomi hesitated, then took the basket. Inside were early spring greens, a few eggs, and a folded square of cloth. I didn't ask for anything, Naomi said quietly. You didn't have to. You've been feeding 3 mouths on what's left of last year's stores. I know how thin that gets. Naomi set the basket on the table. She was tired of pretending she didn't need anyone. Thank you. Adeline nodded. You've got a man now who'd do near anything to make sure you don't go without. You know that. Naomi met her eyes. I'm only just learning. Adeline pulled out a chair and sat, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Zeke's not the sort that speaks on things unless he means them. And he don't make promises light. I think I was afraid of how much he meant it. Adeline gave a dry chuckle. That's the thing about these mountains. They don't tolerate half measures. Neither do the men who choose to stay on him. Naomi sat across from her, folding her hands. He's been alone a long time, hasn't he? Adeline's face softened. Since his brother died in the blizzard 6 winters ago. That boy was all he had left. After that, Zeke stopped trying to find somewhere else to go. Just stayed, kept to the work, until you came. The wind rattled softly at the window. Naomi looked toward it, uncertain what to do with the warmth unfurling in her chest. She'd never meant to be anyone's turning point. I'm not sure I know how to give anyone my whole self anymore, she admitted, voice low. You already are, Adeline said. You just don't see it yet. The door creaked behind them. Jacob stepped in with flushed cheeks and a pine cone in his hands. Ma, I made a trade with Henry, he said breathlessly. I gave him my marble and he gave me this. It smells like the woods. Naomi reached for him and pulled him into her lap. "It does, sweetheart." Adeline stood, brushing her skirt. "You've got what you need now. Just don't forget to let it grow." Naomi watched her go, the door closing softly behind her. Jacob leaned his head against her shoulder, humming something tuneless. Outside, the spring wind shifted again. Naomi stayed still, cradling her son and thinking of the man who had looked her in the eye and offered her a steadiness she'd nearly walked away from. She wasn't running anymore, but standing still came with its own kind of courage. Zeke returned just before dusk, his coat dusted from the trail and his boots carrying the weight of a man who'd ridden hard and thought harder. Naomi watched him from the porch, her hands resting on the arms of the rocking chair she hadn't sat in since autumn. Jacob was inside, drawing pictures of cattle and rivers on a scrap of brown wrapping paper, his tongue between his teeth in concentration. Zeke unsaddled his gelding in silence. Naomi didn't speak until he turned toward the house. "I boiled a pot of beans earlier," she said. "They're still warm." He nodded, pausing at the bottom step. "I mended the north fence line. Henry's been letting the calves wander too close to the break." She studied him. "You didn't have to fix it yourself." "I didn't mind." He stepped up onto the porch and looked past her into the house where lamplight flickered soft against the window glass. "I thought maybe you'd want to take a ride tomorrow. Just you and me. I haven't ridden anywhere for myself in a long time. Then it's time." She stood, brushing her skirt smooth. "Jacob would need watching. I already asked Adeline. She said he can help her feed the hens." Naomi tilted her head. "You planned this." "I did." She wasn't used to someone setting things in place for her. It made her feel seen in a way that scraped against old instincts. "You're not expecting anything in return?" she asked, voice low. Zeke met her eyes. "I expect you to breathe a little. That's all." They stood like that for a moment, distance folding between them until she reached for his hand without thinking. He let her take it. Inside, Jacob called for her to come see the horse he'd drawn. Naomi didn't let go right away. "Do you trust what we're building?" she asked. "I've trusted it since the first time you looked at me like you were hoping I'd prove you wrong." She blinked. "About what?" "That some men leave when the weather turns hard." She nodded once, sharp and quiet, then turned toward the door. "Come in. You've been in the wind too long." Zeke followed her into the warmth, pausing only to hang his hat on the peg beside the door. Jacob held up the drawing. "That's you, Mr. Zeke. And that's your horse. I didn't know how to draw your rope, so I just made it a line." Zeke crouched beside him. "Looks about right to me." Naomi watched the two of them, something easing behind her ribs. She moved to the stove and ladled beans into the clay bowls, the scent thick and rich in the air. She set them on the table and poured water into the tin cups, then sat across from Zeke as Jacob climbed onto his stool. They ate without rush, the kind of quiet comfort that comes from people who no longer feel the need to fill every silence. When Jacob yawned and leaned into Naomi's side, she kissed the top of his head and said, "Bed." He grumbled but obeyed, dragging his blanket behind him. Naomi followed and tucked him in, pressing her palm to his cheek a moment longer than needed. When she returned to the kitchen, Zeke had cleared the bowls and stood near the hearth, his hands resting loosely at his sides. "I never thought I'd have a reason to sit down at a family table again," he said. Naomi approached him slowly. "You have one now." He looked down at her. "Do you want this to last?" "Yes." "Then let's not waste the time we've been given." She reached up and brushed her fingers against the place where his jaw met his throat. "I'm still learning how to rest. Then I'll be patient." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm not used to that either." Zeke leaned in, his forehead brushing hers. "You will be." The lamp burned low beside them. Outside, the wind had gone still. and for the first time in years, Naomi felt no need to leave before sunrise. The trail wound along the edge of the river, where cottonwoods leaned low and the thawed water moved fast over the stones. Naomi rode beside Zeke in silence, her skirts tucked carefully over the saddle horn, her hands steady on the reins. A soft breeze moved through the budding branches, carrying the scent of damp cedar and iron-rich soil. The world was greening again. They'd been riding since just after breakfast, keeping a slow, even pace. Zeke had said little beyond pointing out a deer track or noting where a landslide had narrowed the ridge path. He stayed a horse's length ahead, glancing back only when the trail narrowed. And Naomi, for once, didn't feel the need to speak. The quiet between them had shifted. They crested a rise just as the sun reached its highest point. Below, a small meadow opened between the hills, ringed with dogwood and alder, the grass high and gold-tipped. Zeke dismounted first, tying his horse to a crooked fence post left over from some half-finished cattle run. Naomi slid down a moment later, her legs stiff from the ride. "You brought us here on purpose," she said, brushing dust from her gloves. "I did." She shaded her eyes and looked around. "It's beautiful, but feels forgotten. No one's run cattle through here since before the war. My brother and I used to camp here when we were boys." She turned toward him. "You never talk about him." He sat on a flat stone near the fence, resting his forearms on his knees. "He was younger, quieter than me. Couldn't ride worth a damn at first, but he learned. We used to come out here and pretend we owned the land clear to the timberline." Naomi sat in the grass beside him, her back to the sun-warmed rock. Did he want to run the ranch? He wanted to build something that would last. I think that's why he stayed even after the rest of the family drifted off. She plucked a blade of grass and rolled it between her fingers. "And you?" "I stayed for him. Then I stayed because I didn't know where else to go." He looked over at her. "Until last year." She met his eyes, the sunlight sharp in her throat. "You think this could last? I wouldn't have brought you here if I didn't." She looked out toward the far side of the meadow where the river curved again into shadow. "I used to think love was something that had to be earned through pain, that if it came easy, it'd vanish just as quick." Zeke leaned back, letting the sun catch the edge of his jaw. "Maybe it doesn't have to be easy or hard. Just real." They sat without speaking for a while, listening to the wind move through the grass and the ripple of water against stone. Naomi closed her eyes against the brightness and let herself rest against the rock. She hadn't expected the stillness to feel this safe. "You didn't ask me what I want," she said at last. "What do you want?" "A home where I don't have to prove myself every day. A place Jacob won't have to earn someone's attention just to feel worth something." Zeke reached over and took her hand, his grip warm and certain. "That's what I want too." She turned her head to look at him. "I spent so long surviving. I forgot how to want anything beyond tomorrow. Then let's take it slow. You don't owe me anything but honesty." Naomi squeezed his hand. "I want to try." He nodded once. "That's enough." A hawk circled overhead, its shadow skating across the grass. Naomi stood and brushed her skirt clean, then walked toward the edge of the clearing. Zeke followed, their steps quiet on the earth. At the riverbank, she knelt and dipped her hand into the cold water. Zeke crouched beside her, watching the current move around her fingers. "When Jacob's older," she said, "I want him to know he came from something steady." Zeke looked at her hand in the river, then back at her. "He will, because you stayed." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wild mint and wet stone. Naomi straightened and wiped her hands on her apron, then turned toward their horses. "We should head back," she said. Zeke untied the reins. "We'll come again. Maybe bring Jacob next time." Naomi smiled, the thought settling warm beneath her ribs. He'd like that. They mounted and turned their horses toward the trail home. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows behind them, but the road ahead felt wide and clear. As they rode in step, Naomi glanced sideways at Zeke and said, "I never imagined peace could feel like this." He tipped his hat against the sun. "It's only the beginning." And it was. The wedding was held in the pasture behind the house, where the ground sloped gently toward the cottonwoods and the warm season had coaxed wildflowers into bloom. Naomi stood beside Zeke beneath a cedar arch Henry had built from felled limbs, her hand in his, the scent of fresh pine and turned earth rising around them. The breeze lifted the edge of her shawl and carried with it the voices of the gathered hands and neighbors, quiet but joyful. Jacob stood between them, holding a ring strung on a leather cord, his boots too big and his smile shy. Adeline read the words they'd chosen, her voice steady, and when Zeke turned to Naomi, his thumb brushed the inside of her wrist light, but certain. "I'll never own much," he said, "but what's mine is yours. And if you ever doubt where you belong, you look to me." Naomi didn't try to keep her voice from trembling. "I thought I was finished with love. I didn't know it could feel like coming home." Jacob pressed the ring into Zeke's hand, and Zeke slid it onto Naomi's finger with care. No gold, just polished iron, shaped by the blacksmith who lived down the trail, but warmer to her than any precious metal. The guests clapped when they kissed brief, reverent, and Naomi felt her spine loosen in a way it never had before, like she'd shed a weight she hadn't known she was carrying. They ate at long tables under the open sky, with food brought by neighbors and music played on a borrowed fiddle. Jacob sat on Adeline's lap, too full on biscuits to move, while Naomi leaned into Zeke's shoulder, listening to the low hum of voices and the scrape of chair legs against packed dirt. Later, when the guests had gone and the dusk had turned violet, Naomi stood with Zeke at the edge of the corral, watching the horses shift in the dim light. "I used to think joy meant something loud," she said. Zeke wrapped an arm around her waist. "It doesn't have to." She glanced back at the house. "You know, the roof will need patching before snow returns. I'll see to it. And the south field's still too wet for planting. I reckon we'll wait it out. Let the land speak first." She smiled, turning to him. "There's still so much I don't know how to do. You'll learn. We both will." He kissed her brow, slow and sure. "We've got time." They walked back toward the house together, Zeke carrying Jacob, who'd fallen asleep in a nest of blankets near the porch. Naomi opened the door, and the warmth of the fire met them. She moved to turn down the lamp while Zeke laid Jacob in the small bed tucked behind the curtain. The boy murmured something in his sleep but didn't stir. Later, in the quiet of their room, Naomi sat on the edge of the bed unbuttoning her sleeves. Zeke knelt beside the wash basin, pouring water from the kettle. The firelight caught his face in profile, and she watched the line of his jaw move as he worked. "I want to build a table," he said. "One long enough for holidays, even if we don't have many folks to fill it yet." She crossed the room, slipping her arms around his waist from behind. "We might in time." He turned, resting his hands over hers. "You ever think about that?" "I do." He brushed his lips across her knuckles. "We'll make it right." They climbed into bed, the quilt tucked over them, the night air cool but not cold. Naomi lay with her cheek pressed to his chest, listening to his breath slow. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she whispered. "You are," he said. "With me, you are." She closed her eyes, and silence settled between them, not heavy, but whole. By midsummer, the house had changed. Zeke built a small addition off the back. One room with 2 windows, a proper bed for Jacob, and space for a cradle Naomi hadn't yet spoken aloud about wanting. She stitched curtains from old flour sacks, and Zeke carved hooks for coats and shelves for her books. Jacob started asking questions about planting and calving and why the creek ran faster after rain. Zeke answered all of them, sometimes slow and sometimes with a laugh, and Naomi listened, heart full, as their boy began to believe in permanence. Adeline came every Sunday with preserves and news, always leaving with a smile and never staying too long. The ranch hands kept the fields in order, and Naomi found herself learning names for things she hadn't known to care about: types of soil, the signs of good hay, how to mend a harness strap without splitting the leather. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills and Naomi stood at the stove stirring stew, Zeke came in with dust on his shoulders and a look in his eye that made her pause. He crossed to her, took the spoon from her hand, and kissed her like he'd been waiting all day to do it. "You still glad you stayed?" he asked. She leaned into him, forehead to his. Every single day. They ate with Jacob between them, the boy chattering about a frog he'd found near the ditch, and later, when the dishes were washed and the fire banked low, Naomi stepped out onto the porch to find Zeke whittling by lantern light. She sat beside him, resting her head on his arm. "What are you making?" He held up the shape, leg of a chair. "Thought we'd need another one soon." She ran a hand over her belly, where the first signs of life had begun to stir. "We will." Zeke set the wood aside and pulled her close. The night stretched out around them, quiet and open, the stars sharp above the ridgeline. Naomi breathed in the scent of pine and smoke and the man beside her, anchoring her to a life she'd once thought she'd lost the right to dream of. They stayed like that long after the lantern burned out. There was no need for words. They were already home.